I'm Joy Pullmann, and I'm the executive editor at the Federalist, and I'm excited to be joined today by Indiana's outgoing Attorney General, Curtis Hill. Curtis, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for having me.
When we have folks on for the Federalist Radio Hour for the first time, we always ask them to give just kind of a personal introduction to them. Tell me about your background, anything that you like. For example, I love to tell people that I'm a mom of 6 kids. It's kind of one of those things you wouldn't have in a kind of professional interview. So tell me kind of how a little bit of your life story and how you got to be in the position that you are.
Sure, Joy. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you having 6 kids. You're one of the few people that has more than me.
Yes.
My wife, Teresa, and I have 5 children.
Yeah.
From 26 to 19. And they've taken up a great deal of our time and interest, as children should. But I was born and raised in Indiana, in Elkhart, Indiana. Went to school at Indiana University, School of Business, where I have a degree in marketing. And then I went to law school in Bloomington as well. I met my wife, Teresa, while she was in undergraduate and I was in law school. We got married, and as I indicated, we've got 5 children. I returned back to my hometown of Elkhart after law school to practice law and to become a deputy prosecuting attorney, which I did for a number of years. And then around 2002, I ran for prosecuting attorney. So I was the elected prosecutor in Elkhart County, ran for re-election, and was elected 4 times as the Elkhart County prosecuting attorney. Gained a pretty tough reputation as a fierce competitor. And that was great for my own hometown. Then decided to move forward and run for Attorney General. I had an interest in doing what I had done for the folks in Elkhart, which I thought was good work on a broader basis and to take on some bigger issues. And so I ran for Attorney General in 2016 and was honored to receive the support of so many people in the state of Indiana. And over the past 4 years have operated as Attorney General, and it's one of my proudest accomplishments.
And so I actually became a big fan of you, and I'm going to make a caveat to our listeners that Mr. Hill has no idea that I was about to say this, but when the lockdowns happened in March in Indiana, and I don't think it was right away, but within several weeks of things happening, my husband was reading to me the legal opinions that you were issuing as state attorney general that related to the lockdowns. And we were basically, sitting in our living room cheering you on and just really excited about the things that you were writing, because we felt like, we're people who care about the Constitution, about the law, about our individual liberties, all of those things that, it seems like you and I share in common. But it didn't feel like you were basically the only person, especially within our state, that was giving a voice to those sorts of things. And of course, that is not just an Indiana, a Hoosier issue. That's a nationwide, a global issue. And I think you were really brave in those initial times, when people were a lot more scared. We had a lot less information about the virus that we do now. And I think that everything that's happened since then has really vindicated your approach. But tell me more about why you chose to stick your neck out. And well, you should introduce our listeners as well. Basically, explain to them what your legal reasoning was, kind of the issues that you went through with releasing your opinions about that. And then explain why you decided to, I think, take a risk and go out and actually proclaim your fidelity to the Constitution while everyone around you and still is continuing to basically pretend like they can be suspended indefinitely.
Well, thank you, Joy. Thank you for recognizing that. When this thing started, when this pandemic scare began in essentially in March, none of us knew what was going on. We were all lost. We had no answers. We were getting confusing information. We were even getting wrong information. We were told masks were not effective. Then we were told masks were effective, which basically meant we couldn't trust anybody. So we went from one day of hearing that Indiana would never shut down to the very next day, Indiana's engaging in a shutdown. And right away, I was concerned because we are freedom-loving people. Sometimes we don't know that, but one of the things that makes us tick as Hoosiers, what makes us tick as Americans, is we're free, and we take that for granted. We don't stop to think about how fragile that is. And I remember saying at the time that Hoosiers and Americans could tolerate 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks of an infringement on their rights to try to sort through that. But you go any further than that, and there's going to be trouble because we're not used to that. We're not an Eastern Bloc nation or a South American nation that deals with these types of things from their government. So I was concerned about that from the get-go in terms of how that would look. But in the beginning stages, in the first couple of weeks, I think everybody was willing to restrict themselves a little bit for the sake of trying to figure this out.
Right. And governors do have emergency powers, but they tend to be limited to 30 to 60 days, and we're well past that now.
They are temporary problems, and they don't contemplate what we just went through. And the concern that I had was that we were having a litany of executive orders that were extraordinary measures. We're not used to them, providing an extraordinary amount of power to the executive without the type of data to back it up, and that it would set an unruly precedent moving forward. And I think that's exactly what has occurred.
It is.
Freedom does not take a back seat to a pandemic. It doesn't mean that we're not cautious. It doesn't mean that we don't voluntarily take measures that would be in our own best interest and the best interest of our neighbors. But we don't like to be told what to do if there's no basis for that. And throughout this entire pandemic, we've had, as I alluded to earlier, we've had this piece of information that's proven not to be true. We've had that piece of information that's proven not to be true. So we don't know what to do anymore. And what
kind of the bases on which the initial assumptions have basically, most of them in very large part been proven to be false, but we're continuing to act as if we've gotten no more new information since March.
And we've fallen into this position where we have to do something, and we're willing to do the wrong thing in order to do something. And I think we're better than that. We don't have to do something if something doesn't work. Early on, we took a position of analyzing what was the proper authority, what was the statutory authority. In the very first executive order, we saw deficiencies, and we communicated some of those deficiencies to the governor's office. There was very little communication coming back, which was troubling.
So rather than hearing internal pushback saying, you're crazy, or we have to save lives, I just can't, let a little thing like the law get in the way of saving people. You didn't just hear very much at all.
No, there was a desire to be able to take executive action and continue to move these orders, 30 days at a time. If you look at the actual statute, and we did, the governor does have executive authority, but there is a limitation. It wasn't contemplated that you could continue to do this over and over and over again. So we took the position of analyzing what could be done. When we got to the point of masks being mandated, we quickly put out an opinion on that, characterizing the governor's actions as unconstitutional in the sense that he was on his own stating a criminal activity or defining what was crime.
So he was basically trying to pass a law by himself without the consent of the legislature, which equals the consent of the governed.
Executive fiat. We don't do that here. And some
Except
would say,
we do.
and some would say that the ends justify the means, and never in a constitutional setting. It was also somewhat bothersome that there was no effort to call the General Assembly back into session. Now, I don't want to say that the General Assembly would have had answers and could have magically made our lives better, but the General Assembly are those who are closest to the people. And the fact that that fully 1/3 of our state government was not engaged in this process for months. In fact, not until the session just opened up a few days ago in January 2021.
This whole entire time.
They've been completely out of this. So we were concerned about that. So we did take a position of where we thought appropriate, asserting the constitutional protections and making sure that people were aware that those protections are still there and are still worth fighting for.
Well, what's kind of been breathtaking to me has been to read your very good, and I don't, you can correct me on this, but I don't think your legal analysis was ever answered by the governor. He just basically, he didn't I wouldn't say he ignored it, because it seemed that the subsequent, for example, the executive orders about mask mandates were issued as guidance. So kind of like, obviously he had read the fact that you said you don't have any power to make everybody wear masks, but he just kind of continued to say, tell the basically communicate to the news media, well, I just decree A, B, and C, and the news media would tell Hoosiers, well, that's a mandate. And then the good little Hoosiers would say, oh, well, we have to obey the authorities. And they would do it, even though if someone had challenged it in court, they could have, at least according to your opinion, made a pretty good run for it on the basis of the merits of the question.
I think you're absolutely right. It was stunning that we could suggest things that were not really true to form by the executive order, and there would be changes that would be made, but they wouldn't be announced. I go back to one of the biggest concerns that we had was Easter weekend. Going into Easter weekend, we had an executive order that came out and was very, very harsh on church gatherings.
Yes.
And separated church gatherings from other large gatherings, which we determined, and I think quite correctly, was discriminatory towards religious institutions.
Right.
We communicated that. No one heard anything from the executive office to correct it, but quietly there were changes made on the website in terms of
we noticed those because
there was language before that said
they kind of massaged it,
shall that, and the shalls were taken and more mays were put in, so it was more guidance as opposed to mandatory. So those are the types of things that would happen, and the same thing happened with the criminal sanctions. The criminal sanctions were announced in a press conference, and so then we came out and said, no, you can't do that. Well, we didn't hear anything more other than when the executive order came out, the criminal sanctions were gone. There were no criminal sanctions which had been alluded to. So yes, you're right. There were changes that were made, but there wasn't any acknowledgement that there was any give and take or communication in that respect.
Well, I think because if the governor had acknowledged them, then he would basically be saying, I'm an emperor with no clothes.
Well, that's it would be.
It's all right. You don't have to editorialize like me, but that's my take.
It would be an acknowledgement that perhaps it was not thought out fully.
So it seems like, what we're saying is, therefore, the governor, even if he didn't formally acknowledge it, he had clearly read your opinions, and his legal team were informing him, okay, maybe you're going to be challenged if you actually make this a legitimate executive order. So we'll just call it guidance and trust the gullibility and the ignorance of the people to do the rest. And that really worked.
Yeah.
That really worked. So, which, let's be clear to our listeners, which you probably can guess, but Indiana is a Republican state. Both houses of our legislature are controlled by Republicans. They have been for about a decade. And our governor is a Republican. So it's supposed to be conservative, but here's a completely lawless person, who goes around saying, I support the Constitution. I'm sure he would say, I believe in the rule of law, but he's been completely lawless for nearly for the past 9 months. What can be done about that?
Well, it's very easy. We have political labels, Republicans and Democrats, and we have expectations of what these folks do. It's very easy to say that you're for something or you stand for something, but when you're in a position of leadership, you have opportunities to demonstrate. And so it's not, for example, we have so many people who talk about being pro-life. Oh, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-life. Well, what does that mean until you've been required to take action that demonstrates what you mean about that? How far do you take that? From my standpoint, we've demonstrated through our actions that we believe that an unborn fetus is a human life. We believe that those who are pro-abortion want to remove the humanity from that equation in order to convince people that what they're doing, what they're terminating, is not human. That's how that industry goes. But we have to do more than talk about it. We have to demonstrate it. That's why when the Cloffer situation came along, and we found over 2,000 remains in another state, there was no statutory responsibility for the Attorney General to get involved in that at all. It was unprecedented. We did it because
I'm just going to insert for our listeners that let me make sure. I mean, basically, this was the fact that there was an abortionist who I believe was operating in Illinois, but it was found in his Indiana home that he
No,
had
he
remains.
was
Okay.
Dr. Klopfer was an Indiana abortionist operating in
Okay.
3 counties in Indiana.
3 counties in
And
Indiana.
and it was found upon his death. It was found
Right.
that his home in Illinois, his
His home was
garage,
in Okay.
his home was in Illinois, and he had a store. He had in storage in his garage over
Yes.
2,200 remains of fetuses,
Yes.
and then he had another couple of hundred in the trunk of a car. And
Oh, mercy.
they had been there for nearly 2 decades.
Oh.
And as I said, there was no statutory anything that
Mm-hmm.
suggested that the Indiana Attorney General had anything to do with this. What we did was we initiated an investigation to consult with the folks in Illinois to assert that these were remains that belonged in Indiana and in accordance to our laws should be buried in Indiana out of humanity. And that demonstrates not just that we're pro-life, it demonstrates that we're going to do things that support the humanity and the existence of the unborn.
What do you suggest? Legally speaking, we're as we mentioned, we're in this situation where we have a lot of talk and not a lot of securing of our very fundamental rights, such as the right to life. And we're in the midst of suspension of many of our constitutional liberties now for, I bet it's going to be more than a year by the time this is all over. What are concrete, specific things, that normal people as well as elected office holders can do to change that situation, the situation in which you have people just following dictates that are illegal, extra legal, however you want to put it, or people saying that they're pro-life, and we continue to have not as much envelope pushing on that as the constituency of a state like Indiana would support. So what are specific and concrete things that both elected office holders and voters like me, people who are listening, what can we do when we're in this situation, in this situation?
Joy, we have to first wake up. We have to pull the veil away from our faces and recognize what we're up against. We're living in a society and in a time where we're losing our sense of absolutes.
Yeah.
Everything is fuzzy and hazy, and we have the cancel culture. We have the if you step out of line, if you say the wrong thing, then you're going to get we're going to hit you on social media, and we do it with anonymity. We can anonymously tear you down. So what happens is good people who understand the Constitution, who understand freedom, who understand what this nation's about, become afraid to stand up for their rights and the rights of this nation. And so we allow things to just kind of go on because it's easier to do. You don't have to worry about the pushback and the criticisms and the attacks. And that's what happens. So we have to be courageous. We have
So
to.
do you think, for example, like the state legislature, I view the fact that they didn't go into session and just let the governor executive order his way through the past 9 months, that seems to be an act of cowardice. They should have said, we need to be in session. The people have obvious business that need to be done. I mean, so for example, we need to pass a law rather than have illegal executive orders happening. And so we need to hash that out and put our necks on the line and stand up for it and let our constituents, take it out on us on the ballot box, either
Absolutely.
way.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Joy. We wrote about that. I wrote a letter to the governor, and I wrote a letter to the Senate Pro Tem and the Speaker of the House, and I suggested that the senator and the Speaker demand to be brought into session, brought into a special session, not stand on the sidelines, and that's because they had a responsibility to engage. Here's what's interesting about that. They chose not to, but there are several members of the Senate, several members of the House who were absolutely frustrated because they kept getting information from their constituents asking about these
Right.
mandates, asking about all these, what's
Yeah.
going on with this, what's going on with that. You're my state rep, you're my state senator. And they're saying, I don't know. We're being left out. So absolutely.
Interesting.
That's absolutely what needed to happen. And as I said before, not to suggest that there's anything magical about our General Assembly coming up with the right answer. Who knows what the right answer is? But to give confidence to the people that whatever is being offered is being talked about, is being debated, that there's transparency, that it's not just some edict that's coming out of one office, because that's not how we operate. We operate under the sunshine to see exactly what's happening, and everything
that we know who's, like, if our representative, he has gone on record saying, I think these facts, seem to be established, and therefore, as a result of them, I think we should have these rules for our society about how to handle COVID, how to handle schools being open, how to handle masks. And then the constituents can either disagree or agree, but at least, the issues have been aired, put on the record, and then our democratic process has been followed.
And they're accountable. I mean,
Yes.
that's what happens. As of now, everybody can say, well, it wasn't me, I didn't have anything to do with that.
Right.
But it's been the biggest crisis in Indiana's history. And we have people standing on the sidelines. So I think that was a real whiff on the part of the legislative leadership to stay on the sidelines and not participate in that process. And I say it's a whiff. They let down the community, they let down the people, because people wanted to see leadership and make sure that everybody was fully engaged.
I mean, and what can the voters do, when their elected representatives are not operating within the confines of the law and not representing our concerns, and actually, duly passing laws rather than just letting us live under suspended constitutional rights?
Well,
what can we do about that? Sue? And I don't even know if the courts would think we'd have standing.
Well, ultimately your answer of what voters can do is vote. I mean, it's gather the information, understand the information, and participate in the system, and hold people accountable for the issues that are most important to them. What has a tendency to happen is more of a gloss over. Like the mask, for example. It's people were getting into, are you wearing a mask or you're not wearing a mask? I don't think that was the issue at all. I think most people are very comfortable wearing a mask. They just weren't comfortable having the government tell them that they had to wear a mask without giving them information on as to why. This pandemic is very serious. It's not to be suggesting that it's not serious,
Right.
but the way that it's been used as a mechanism to control people is a harbinger of the potential to come.
Yeah.
Could
you talk more about that? What could happen, under these legal precedents that have been set?
We're seeing it already. We're seeing empowerment of local county health officials to then assert new rules upon the populace. So today it's the pandemic, and we say, well, it's the pandemic and people are getting sick. Well, next winter, maybe it's the flu, maybe it's something else. Have we now?
Maybe we'll decide that if you need to lose some weight, we're going to have people come and monitor your heart rate.
Because Joy, it's because it's for your own good. We're just that idea of it's being for your own good. So much has happened in our history, not just our nation's history, but world history, on the basis of it was for your own good. When you had slaves released in the 19th century and placed on sharecroppers' land and Jim Crow laws, there were people who would say, well, that's just for your own good because you people are ignorant, you don't know, so we're going to make sure we do this because it's in your own good. Well, it wasn't for the good of the people who were experiencing it.
Maybe I can decide what's for my own good rather than you.
Especially in this country. So what's happened by virtue of this springing forth of these executive orders and this newfound authority of these local health officials is this idea that a person can make rules that affect an entire population, and the entire population just kind of stands by and lets it happen. One of the most distressing things about what we've experienced in COVID is the shutting down of our economy, the shutting down of our way of life. And as I said,
basically
earlier,
banning people from supporting themselves indefinitely.
Well, and for what? What was the basis for that? I mean, for the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks, fine, shut things down, get a handle on things. But when you're not having any answers, do we want to make things worse? We had people, Joy, I know you know this, we had people who lost loved ones in nursing homes, not to COVID, but to all the other things, including broken hearts, because the people who really cared for them, not the nursing home folks, but their families who would come in and administer to them their needs, couldn't do so.
I had a friend who was in the hospital, and it was for something unrelated to COVID, and he got a negative COVID test, but he had, I forget, either a fever or something that was a symptom. So they treated him as if he was a COVID case and put him in isolation. And, he said he had to raise a big stink. The nurses wouldn't come into his room. They'd shove cold food, through the door. And he was just, but he was talking about, if I had to be in there, for longer, he's an older man, away from my family, away from my kids, and who's going to check up on the doctor's chart for me? He was really, really
Oh,
frightened and outraged by the fact that that happened to him.
same thing happened to my wife. My wife's father had a stroke a couple
Hmm.
days after COVID. He's in the hospital. None of his kids can go in and visit him.
Yeah.
This fellow, he wakes up out of a stroke. He thought
Oh,
his family had abandoned him because he,
oh,
he couldn't understand
yeah,
where his children were,
right.
and no one was there to explain it for him. So
Yeah.
it's a distressing situation, and this is all of this control aspect of what's occurred. And so I'm hoping that people recognize what this has all been and wake up to a greater sense that we do not want to live in a society where we are managed or controlled, even if it's proposed to be for our own good.
I am feeling, sometimes I'm on the edge of despair about whether that can ever happen. But I think even if it doesn't, you have to act as if it may, because otherwise it's going to be a dark life. you
Well,
know.
it's easy to see. I agree with you. I think the same way. But I'm hearkened that we've had times in our history where we have seen dark days and there's sunlight at the end, or we've seen examples of leaders who have come out and helped us uh, get
That's true.
past certain things. So there's always hope.
Yeah.
And right now, it's the things that we're up against now is we're up against a relentless 24/7 news media. We're up against a social media presence that is unforgiving. So we have factors that really make it difficult to break through this. When I speak about absolute truths, um, when I speak about political correctness, things that try to keep us from recognizing the truth of the situation. Today we can very easily say, well, I'm going to identify myself as a different sex. Imagine in the 1950s or the 60s if someone black could simply say, I identify as white. So, I'm going to sit at the counter now. It's not
Yeah.
that easy. But we sort of have this sort of let it flow type mentality. And at some point, we have to be in a position to define things for what they are and the truth that they represent.
And that's, I think, a good opportunity to have me ask you something I also wanted to talk about. And I guess I'm trying to think about which avenue I want to go with first. But as you mentioned, you have had a career as a prosecutor. Your life has been spent in the criminal justice system. It's something that also, has been a very hot conversation. I would say over the past couple of years, but really intensified with all the Black Lives Matter protests and rioting and events that happened this spring. So and I have reluctance about, it's kind of a two-pronged thing, because I don't want to just ask you that because you're black. That it kind of irks me, but at the same time, that's true, and it's part of who you are. So how about you talk about how you feel about maybe getting asked those things, but also then tell me more about, like, what kind of conversations have you been having in your family about that issue, as well as in your experience with the criminal justice system. How well does it match some of the narratives that we've been hearing? So I guess there's a lot of things there. I can kind of, you can take them in whatever order you want.
Well, it's I don't mind the question because I think one of the things that we have to get used to is looking at different perspectives
Yeah.
and trying to find empathy
Yeah.
behind different perspectives, because that's one of the things that we don't do well. We have a long history of racial discord in this country,
Hmm.
and now we're at a renewed height of
Hmm.
discord. And it's interesting because you would think that several years after Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, we would not have this type of racial discord. But you have to dig in deep. Um, from my standpoint, I'm a former prosecutor. I support law enforcement, and when I hear about uh, the tragic shooting by a police officer of an unarmed anybody, I'm concerned about that. But I don't view that as a overt indication of a racist America. Racism does exist in America, but I don't believe that America is fundamentally racist.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference there. Now, having said that, I also believe that it's important for whites to understand where some of the Black angst comes from. I was at a meeting, I've been in several meetings where folks have said, well, Curtis, why do they say Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. And I said, well, yeah. So the people say Black Lives Matter, and then you shout back all lives matter, and then it becomes a shouting match.
It goes nowhere.
It goes nowhere. So I said, why don't you think of it like this? When someone says Black Lives Matter, instead of coming back with a retort, all lives matter, why don't you say, well, let me think about that for a second. Has there ever been a time in this country where Black lives didn't matter? And it's very easy to do. You go back to pre-colonial days when Blacks were brought here in slave ships, didn't matter much. You go to constitutional days, there was nobody talking about freeing Black people. Mm-hmm. So you go another 100 years of slavery, which we can clearly say that Black lives didn't matter. Now the slaves are freed. So you would say, well, Black lives matter. No, not really, because they were left ignorant, homeless, with no real prospects other than to be dependent on others for quite some period of time. So the Black lives didn't matter at that point. So you go on through another 100 years of Jim Crow, segregation, colored drinking fountains, restrooms, public accommodations. And then you get to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, integration. So you would say, okay, finally, Black lives matter, right? Wrong, because you have to go forward into the 1970s and you still have busing in major metropolitan areas to enforce a 1954 court decision. So if you look through the history of Black America from the lens of a Black person, you would see that Black lives have not ever really mattered that much. So now you see an event that unfolds in real time, and a Black person sees that event. They're going to look at that event with that 400 years of history as a part of their lens, and then they're going to look at it from how they have viewed life, and then they apply it to what happens. You know what they say? They say, here we go again.
Yeah.
And as I've described, it's kind of like Charlie Brown and Lucy when Lucy's holding the football, and she says, okay, Chuck, I'll hold the football. Go ahead and kick it. And every time she pulls the football back and Chuck falls on his bottom. That's kind of what the Black man has faced in America. It's every time they go to kick the football, Lucy pulls it away. And if you think of it from that perspective, and now go back to what the Black community says when they say Black Lives Matter, okay, I have to look at it from that perspective. So my point in going through that is we need to, both sides or all sides have to develop an empathetic way of understanding what the other's position is, and giving the other's position some fuel to exist. And the same thing.
To recognize that there is legitimacy behind it.
Maybe
you don't agree with every single way that every single person might apply it, but you can say, oh, I can see kind of where you're coming from.
Exactly. I mean, we have to be in a position to get past the conversation. I mean, when we talk about racial issues, and this is the discussion I've been having recently with a lot of people, what's the solution? We have people out there that they want to fix it. They want an answer. Is the answer reparations? Is the answer an apology? From my standpoint, I think that the answer really comes down to forgiveness. The power of forgiveness in the Black community to recognize there have been wrongs that have been made upon the Black community for generations. We can harbor ill will, we can make demands, but the thing that really is going to move us forward is when we move to the level of forgiveness that we're taught in the Bible, to forgive others, to show mercy. Now that's a pretty mature approach that's going to take some time to get to, but I think that's ultimately the answer in terms of how to bring both sides together. We're going to all have to recognize that we've all screwed up. I have stereotypes and biases. Everyone does. So to say, oh, there's not a racist bone in my body, that's not the point. The point is we all have things about us that are questionable, and we need forgiveness.
That we regret.
And we need to offer forgiveness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that we regret or that we did wrong and we wish we could undo,
Sure,
you know.
absolutely.
I'm thinking, I've been thinking a lot of things while you're saying that. One of them is that I think, I mean, it also bothers me when people say stuff like, "Oh, there isn't a racist bone in my body" or whatever, because again, I as a Christian am very aware of how I struggle with doing wrong constantly, you know. But it's also seemed I don't you know, so I think people feel that often they're not being presented with perhaps, you know, their own or their country's history of racism, not to get to forgiveness, but as a club, you know,
Hmm.
to delegitimize and undermine the humanity of themselves, of white people, of America, you know, you name it. So rather than it being an opportunity for people to come, like you said, to have empathy, understanding, and forgiveness, more often people are aware of, oh, this is a trap. You know, you're trying to put me in a box so you can hit me with a very big stick. And I don't want to be in that box.
Well, that's exactly what happens. I mean, it is a there is this gotcha mentality out there, and you know, this whole concept of so-called white privilege, as to suggest that there is something that everyone needs to apologize for their station in life. I think that's ridiculous. I think that one of the things that we have to get past is the perceived inferiority that comes along with what it means to be black. I
Mm,
don't consider myself inferior. So when someone says, you know, the latest thing now, Joy, is to say we have to have inclusion and diversity and equality.
right.
Those are the big three things. Well, let's talk about equality for a minute. In order for me to be equal to someone else, then I have to start off as something other than equal. So I'm either inferior to that other person or superior to that other
Hmm.
person. I have no intention of just being, I don't want to be someone's equal and suggest that I'm inferior to someone else. I just want to be me. I want to be free to have opportunity, to excel to the heights that my talent will get me without being oppressed. But this idea of being someone's equal either means that we have to reduce someone who's maybe smarter or faster than someone else, or that we have to give somebody an advantage who's slower and maybe not as gifted as someone else. Um, in a free society, we 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 want to have equality of opportunity, um, but we have to measure that opportunity through our own devices, through what we offer, through what we bring to the table, and we're getting away from that.
Mm,
And I think that's something that we have to focus on as we move forward. It's not about these platitudes of, well, we have to make sure that we're diverse and inclusive. No, we have to be transparent about who we are. It's not about having uh, 8 blacks and 3 gays and the whole 9 yards and counting. That's just plugging
it's
a gap.
tokenism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who cares about that? It's about being in a
What do you
state.
bring to the table?
Well, and it's about being in a state where you look around and you can feel the love, you can feel the sense of belonging, you can feel that there's an attitude and an approach, a transparency, if you will, that we are all a part of something together. And so transparency, I would take the word transparency and infuse that into this entire equation, because as long as we're open about what we're doing, we're going to do much better at making sure that people have a sense of belonging.
Hmm. There's so many things we could talk about here. Um, One thing that I wanted to mention, especially in the context of this forgiveness, I didn't want to fail to ask you about something that if people Google your name, they're going to find. And this is actually kind of related to the whole rest of our conversation in terms of, so for people who aren't aware, uh, you've been accused in the news media, and I believe, and as you've mentioned, there's ongoing litigation about an incident, I think, with you and not one, but I mean, the allegation is that you groped a woman and made some unsavory comments. And in fact, right after that, and I think if folks who had listened to the rest of our conversation to this point may have a clue why, our governor and a bunch of other Republicans, basically, rather than hearing your side of the story, rather than, waiting for allegations to be considered in court, or you to give your defense, or even, make an apology, or whatever the response would be, just basically said, okay, time for you to resign. And given what we've talked about, their history with you, that's not surprising to anyone. But I want to give, I am curious, because every time I read something in the news media about someone, I distrust it. And that creates, other problems, like, I think, everyone deserves to have, their day in court, but that includes you. But basically, I'd like to hear from you. How has this affected you and your family? What is basically your stance on the issue? If someone, if someone asks you, we were just talking about, right? I'm a sinner. I have things that I've done that are very embarrassing. And if there were months of news cycles about them, it would be, I don't know, I would have to get to some place about that. So kind of tell me, uh, tell me how this has affected you, and basically what's your position on the whole incident. And how are you, I guess, trying to work through it and move forward as a human being?
Well, it's certainly something that has been an unfortunate occurrence in terms of its ramifications. It, going back to the occurrence, it was in March of 2018. The, the major concern I had was the
And it didn't become a thing until this year. So this is, 2 years later.
It's gone on for quite some time. It was a thing then, but it began as a political thing. I mean, it was an allegation that was made to representatives of the General Assembly, who initiated an investigation over a situation over me with no authority to do so. And by the time I found out what they were doing, they leaked the information to the press, and therefore, these were anonymous allegations, and I was sort of just kind of floating out there with these allegations, and suddenly there's calls for my resignation. So it was and it was 4 months after the event. Now, I'll go back to the event. It was after the session closed, the General Assembly session, a group of legislators, state senators, state representatives went to a bar, AJ's Lounge, to celebrate. I was out with a friend, a lobbyist, who had received a phone call, and he was going to go out there, and he asked if I wanted to go with him. And I said, sure, I'd go along. So I went along as a guest of a lobbyist. I would describe, this was a small bar, very crowded. It was after midnight, as the legislative session ended at midnight. It was a long session, long evening. And so it ended at midnight, and the place was crowded with reps, state senators, lobbyists, and whatnot. And I would describe the atmosphere as much like you would a New Year's Eve party, or perhaps a political election night party, where people are drinking alcohol, people are loud, laughing, having fun, telling jokes, telling stories. And I was there talking to people, laughing, joking, very informal, not my typical, more stoic AG role, but just relaxed and buttoned down a bit. And 4 months later, find out that there's allegations that I had touched someone inappropriately, and finding it out through legislators who aren't giving me the information, and then leak the information to the press. It really soured my opinion of many people in government and politics, to go through the process. And we've seen, what's interesting is throughout that process, we've seen examples of other things. I mean, this is an era where suddenly the rules have seemingly changed in terms of what you say and what you do. We saw that in the Kavanaugh situation. What was interesting there is some of the very people who were calling for my resignation and suggesting I had to go were some of Kavanaugh's biggest offenders. We saw other people who had made allegations, or who had supported allegations against me, face their own allegations and not seemingly get the same type of scrutiny. And so it's it's been an interesting run, and as you say, this is 2021 now, but we've seen several iterations and investigations, and um, all seemingly designed to uproot my political career. So it's
And why do you think so, right? Because you would think, as we mentioned earlier, and again, maybe I need to work on this, but I mean, you would think that just given, you would think that you would be, like someone that the state party would want to promote. Maybe not the state party. Sorry, that's too naive. But you would think, someone who is very conservative, intelligent, earned his position to this, number of offices, as well as bringing to the table, especially in Indiana. Uh, I mean, bringing to the table your connections to your local community, the African American sort of crossover in Indiana. That's important. Maybe not important enough to our state Republicans. So you would think that, and instead of basically trying to sabotage you. And again, I don't want to, whatever happened is between you and God, but the unequal treatment there, as well as with the potential that might have, is something that I think there's a lot more under the hood there. So, for example, we're looking at, for example, there's Democratic member of Congress right now. He was literally sleeping with the Chinese spy, for a decade. I bet he's not going to resign. We've had, like you mentioned, a bunch of other, including Republicans, who have a lot more substantiated allegations about, behavior in similar situations or even not similar situations, close ranks around them, rather than saying, oh, you should resign. So you're saying you do feel the unequal treatment and you think it's legitimately there.
I do feel that I do feel that there were decisions made by many of the political folks in both parties, in particular my own, that were very interested in using this allegation as a mechanism for moving me forward. And I think it comes down to this: the Indianapolis political scene, and that's what it is. When you're talking about state house politics, you're talking about Indianapolis, and if you're not handpicked or chosen or a part of the system, you're a threat. And what you found, and what people found in me, and they found it right away, was that I'm my own man. I didn't, with the exception of being elected and therefore owing my opportunity to the voters, I didn't owe anybody for the position that I was in. I wasn't somebody's favorite son. I wasn't somebody's project. I wasn't recruited to run for attorney general. In fact, most of the established Republicans had another candidate in mind. I was able to make a connection with the people through hard work, traveling around the state, and that's where my support came from. So when I got to Indianapolis, I didn't owe anybody anything, and I spoke my mind. I was very known to be outspoken. I don't believe outspoken in a radical way. I think outspoken in a very truthful way. For example, one of the first spats I got into was over the concept of needle exchange. We were dealing with a serious circumstance of heroin addictions and overdose of opioids, and it seemed like a suggested solution was, well, let's just offer needle exchange, and it was sort of a kind of a gloss over. And I looked at the data. Well, the data showed me that there were a whole lot more needles being given out than needles coming back. The way it's supposed to work is you get a dirty needle in, you give a clean needle back, and we kind of overlook the criminality and the drug abuse.
Right.
We're just trying to, so I get the concept, and it's fine for if all you're trying to do is keep people from passing disease, that's one thing. But if you're trying to stop people from overdosing,
handing out more access to drugs.
Giving them more access to drugs is not the answer, especially when you find that one needle coming in and 30 needles going out. And you know what happens? The drug user is going to take the one needle and use it over and over and over, and take the 29 needles and sell them for more drugs. That's the reality. So I'm not afraid to speak the truth about what's really happening, but many of my friends in the State House were more interested in being able to say, look what we did. We've done something about drugs. You've done nothing. You've done nothing to really help the problem. So it's positions like that that I would take. We're in a time now where a lot of people think it's okay to smoke marijuana.
Hmm.
I point out the problems with smoking marijuana. Now, that's not to say that if the FDA comes along and provides a sound clinical review to determine that marijuana can cure this or is helpful with that, and in these dosages and here dosages and in with these side effects,
Someone
then
with terminal cancer could get a
sure.
license for it, right?
And you want to have medical marijuana like that, I'm fine with that. But that's not what we're doing. What we're
Right.
doing is we're having state legislatures declare a substance medical, and then it's being produced in all sorts of various forms and things of that nature. And I think that creates a dangerous situation. So I speak those things, and people uh, get nervous because I think we have common sense. I think that we can pass information along that people that recognize, and it puts me on a track to where I may have more success and more support than other people. And I think that's a part of it.
Well, I feel like I could chat with you for a while, but we're pretty much out of time, and I want to respect your time. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, I think you're outgoing as Indiana's Attorney General, and so I just like to hear from you as the closing question. What's next? What are your plans?
Well, it's an opportunity for me to look at life for the first time in 30 years outside of public service,
Hmm. That sounds
which
good.
well, it sounds interesting. I mean, I love public service. I think I have value and have given value to the positions that I've had. I know for a fact that there are significant things that occurred when I was prosecutor that only occurred because I was the prosecutor. I know that there are significant things that have occurred when I was attorney general only because I was attorney general, and I feel good about that, not from a egocentric way, but in a service way. That there
Mm.
was something that I was able to provide through whatever talent I had, and I hope to be able to do those types of things moving forward. But this is an opportunity for me to shift into another gear. So over the course of the next several weeks and however long it takes, I'll be looking at ways in which I can be of some service to my fellow man, but also take care of my family and do some things that have been neglected for a while I've been engaging in public service. And then down the road, who knows?
I have a friend actually who wanted me to ask you, and I'm reminded now. Would you consider primarying our Senator Todd Young?
I am not. I'm not considering anything right now. As I said, I'm looking forward to an opportunity to sort of relax
Step back and reassess.
from politics. Yeah, I mean, and I think it'll be good for me because this continuous process that has taken place, you don't get a chance to reflect. I'm going to have some time to do things um, privately, and then reflect on how things worked politically. How, gee, I did this way. I did this. Would I do this differently? How should things work? What is our Constitution about? What's our nation about? What are the big issues that we have? I mean, when we look at issues that face us today, um, um, I've got something to say about how we can fix um, our racial problems. I've got something to say about how we should support law enforcement. I've got something to say about how we should educate our kids. I've got something to say about a whole host of things, and I don't need a title or a elected position to say them. I am a free American with a voice, and I can walk into any arena and speak at any point in time, and I choose to do that. So I don't need to run for any office right now. What I need to do is make sure that I pay attention to the world around me, that I continue to believe in God, believe in this country, and believe in the goodness of man, and that working together, that we can work to improve our general lot.
Well, I'm glad that you're a fellow Hoosier. I think the world's better for you being in it. And if you start a YouTube channel or if you have op-eds, I think you have my email address. But I do thank you for your time. I thank you for your service to our state. Like I said, it's been a bright spot for my family in a very, very complicated time. And we've appreciated your voice. Thanks
Thank
for
you very
joining the
much.
Federalist Radio Hour.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.